Joining us now is NBC News presidential historian Michael Beschloss. Mr. Beschloss, it is good to see you again. Thanks very much for joining us tonight.
A pleasure, Rachel.
So tomorrow marks the unofficial end of the 111th Congress, plus or minus the lame duck period.
Right.
Whether you are for all of those accomplishments I just described or against them, historically, how does this Congress stack up in terms of its legislative achievements?
Well, dealt with very basic issues, as you've just said. And, you know, it reminded me as you were talking, Rachel, you remember early in 2008, Barack Obama was in Nevada campaigning. I think he was talking to an editorial board, and he said, I want to be a transformational president, deal with basic issues like Franklin Roosevelt and Ronald Reagan of the conservatives. He was criticized a lot, but the point he was making was, in a way, just what you've said, which is, I want to be a president who uses this moment that may not come again of a party dominating both houses of Congress and also the White House to deal with basic things, not things that might get me reelected or help us win the next midterm election.
Is there, on the issue of sort of long-term political capital versus short-term political capital, is there any reason to think of this president as one who is investing in the long-term image, the long-term impression that Americans have of the Democratic Party as a party that is serious about policy issues? Certainly, we've seen him trade away short-term political capital for taking on some of these hard legislative fights. But is there reason to believe that doing that pays off in the long run in terms of the way people see the parties?
Well, one example would be health care. I mean, Barack Obama could very well have come into the White House and said, you know, I can't deal with health care right now. We've got an economic crisis. It did more than almost anything else to ruin Bill Clinton in the 1994 elections and has been very bad for presidents. But the point is that Obama did it, even though his chief of staff, Rahm Emanuel, begged him not to do it. That shows what kind of a person he is. So I think what he's saying is, you know, it may not be popular at the moment, but the Democratic Party does have to stand for something. And over the long run, that makes us a party strong.
In all likelihood, we're going to be returning to divided government in this country when the next Congress is sworn in. Republicans will likely take control of the House, and they're trying for the Senate. In terms of big landmark achievements throughout American history, in terms of big policy achievements, do those things usually happen when Congress is divided, or are they more often the result of one party having at least temporary control of both the executive branch and the legislative branch?
It's almost always when the White House is of the same party as the Congress. Look at 1965. Lyndon Johnson came in. If you can believe it, Rachel, 2/3 of the Senate was Democrats, 2/3 of the House was Democrats. But even despite that, LBJ said, this doesn't happen very often. I've got 6 months. He used those 6 months to get through the Great Society, Medicare, voting rights, very basic programs. And he said, after that, they're going to start voting against me, and there will be a backlash. He was absolutely right. The Democrats had huge setbacks in Congress in 1966, but LBJ and the Great Society had probably more of an influence on Americans in terms of saying where the Democratic Party is, for well or ill, than perhaps any other president of the period. And
when it comes to selling legislative accomplishment, of course, LBJ is an incredibly relevant precedent, because
a communicator he wasn't.
A communicator that he wasn't. He has this incredibly accomplished legislative record when you're talking about that period that you're talking about there. But ultimately, he gets turfed out and ends up ending his presidency the way he does, mostly because of Vietnam, right?
Right. That's exactly right. And what you want, and this is true with LBJ and Barack Obama, you want a president who does courageous things, and I think you've stated them, but you also want a president who's able to persuade his contemporaries, those of his own generation who have to vote in these elections, that this was the right thing to do. He can't just wait for history to say it was the right thing to do. In politics, you have to really convince the people who are passing on you at the time.
NBC News presidential historian Michael Beschloss, from whom I always learn a ton every time you're on the show. Thank you so much for your time tonight,
Thank
Michael.
you, Rachel.